I always believed that my life was built on precision, control, and unwavering certainty. In the operating room, there was no room for hesitation. A single mistake could mean the difference between life and death. I approached everything in my life the same way: measured, calculated, efficient. My marriage was no exception. Melissa and I had been together for 12 years, and on the surface, we were the perfect couple. Successful, respected, ambitious. She was a high-powered attorney, just as meticulous in her field as I was in mine. We didn't waste time on sentimentality. Our relationship was based on mutual goals, shared ambition, and a quiet understanding that neither of us would ever be reckless enough to jeopardize what we had built together. Or so I thought. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss new stories. If you enjoyed this one, leave a like, it really helps. And don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments. Let's discuss. It started with small things, the kind that should have meant nothing. Melissa had always worked late, but lately it had become a pattern. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find her side of the bed empty, only for her to slip under the covers hours later, her hair smelling of expensive perfume I didn't recognize. When I asked, she brushed it off. Late client meeting, dinner with a colleague, case prep ran over. I had no reason to doubt her, no evidence to the contrary, but something in my gut told me that these weren't just late nights at the office. Then there was her phone. Melissa had never been the type to guard her devices, but now she carried it everywhere, angling the screen away when she texted, keeping it face down on the table. Once I reached for it absent-mindedly while she was in the shower, meaning only to check the time. The moment my fingers brushed against it, I heard her voice, sharp and defensive from the doorway. "What are you doing?" Her reaction was too strong for such an innocent action. She tried to laugh it off, but I saw the tension in her eyes, the way she pulled the phone closer to her body as if it contained something I wasn't supposed to see. The worst part was that I didn't want to believe it. I had built my life on logic and evidence, and there was nothing concrete yet, just a growing unease that I kept pushing aside. I told myself I was overanalyzing, that stress from work was making me paranoid. But doubt is like an infection. Once it takes hold, it spreads. A week later, I found the first real crack in the facade. I was in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner, when Melissa's laptop chimed with a notification. She had left it open on the counter, something she never did. I glanced at the screen. It was a calendar reminder. Flight to Chicago, Thursday, 6 p.m. My stomach tightened. Melissa wasn't supposed to be going anywhere. She hadn't mentioned a trip, no conferences, no cases out of town. I stared at the screen for a long moment before closing the laptop, my pulse steady but my mind racing. I could have confronted her then, asked for an explanation, but I knew how that conversation would go. She would have an answer ready. Some last-minute legal meeting, a favor for a client, something reasonable enough to make me question myself. Instead, I decided to wait, to watch. The night before the flight, she came home later than usual. Her makeup was fresh, her hair styled with more care than I had seen in months. She leaned in to kiss my cheek, and I caught a trace of a scent that wasn't hers. Something musky, masculine. "Long day?" I asked, watching her reaction. A brief hesitation, a flicker of something in her eyes before she smiled. "Exhausting," she sighed, slipping off her heels. "You wouldn't believe the amount of work I had to get through." I nodded, forcing a smile, playing the role of the trusting husband. "You deserve a break." The next evening, I told her I had a late surgery, that I wouldn't be home until after midnight. I watched as she pretended to be disappointed, her expression careful, measured. "That's a shame," she said. "I was thinking we could have a quiet night together." Liar. At 5:30, I left the house, drove 3 blocks away, and parked. I watched as the lights in our bedroom flickered on, as she moved through the room, packing a small suitcase. At 7 p.m., she walked out the door, heels clicking against the pavement, a black dress clinging to her body in a way that told me exactly what kind of trip this was. I followed at a distance, my heart beating with a steady, cold rhythm. She arrived at the airport at 7:40, and she wasn't alone. I saw him before I saw her reaction to him. Tall, younger, dark-haired. Lucas Evans, my protege, the surgical resident I had spent the last 2 years training. The one who had followed me like a shadow, eager to prove himself. The one I had trusted. The one I had mentored. Melissa smiled when she saw him, the kind of smile she hadn't given me in years. She walked into his arms with the ease of someone who had done it before. He kissed her, his hands resting possessively on her waist, and I watched as my wife leaned into him, her body melting against his. I didn't move. I didn't react. I just stood there, watching, cataloging every detail with the same clinical detachment I used in surgery. They boarded the flight together 20 minutes later. I sat in my car long after their plane had taken off, my hands resting on the steering wheel, my mind sifting through every memory, every moment leading up to this. The evidence was undeniable now. Melissa wasn't just having an affair. She was having an affair with someone who owed everything to me. I took a slow breath, steadying myself. I had two choices. I could go home, confront her when she returned, let my anger explode, demand explanations that wouldn't change anything. Or I could wait, plan, prepare. For the first time in my life, I chose the latter. I spent the weekend in a haze of silence. Melissa was gone, thousands of miles away with the man I had mentored, and yet our house felt more suffocating than ever. I moved through it like a ghost, going through the motions, letting the weight of what I had seen settle deep in my bones. I didn't touch her side of the bed, didn't look at the framed photos of us on the walls, didn't let myself react. I wasn't ready to confront her yet. Confrontation was emotional, reckless, and if I had learned anything in my years as a surgeon, it was that precision mattered more than passion. On Sunday evening, just past midnight, I heard the familiar sound of her key in the door. I stayed in the living room, the glow of my laptop the only source of light. She walked in, suitcase rolling behind her, a practiced yawn on her lips as she stretched like a woman exhausted from work. "You're still up?" she asked, feigning surprise. I looked up at her, taking in the carefully curated details. The slightly messy hair, the subtle scent of hotel soap, the faint crease in her blouse from where she had likely fallen asleep against him on the plane. "Late case," I said smoothly, tapping a few meaningless keys on my laptop. "I needed to review some notes." She smiled, the kind of casual, almost condescending smile of someone who believed they were 3 steps ahead. "I feel like I barely saw you this week," she murmured, walking over to kiss my cheek. I let her, breathing in the scent of another man's presence on her skin, feeling the delicate way she tried to mask the betrayal with routine. "We should have dinner tomorrow, just us." I nodded, knowing full well that her suggestion was meant to solidify my trust, to keep me unaware. "Sounds good." She kissed me again, softer this time, then disappeared into the bedroom. I listened as the shower turned on, as she washed away the remnants of him, scrubbing herself clean for the role she played in our life. I sat there in the dark, watching the cursor blink on my laptop screen, and felt the first stirrings of something colder than anger. The next morning, I was up before her, already dressed for work by the time she came downstairs. She had always been a late riser, using my early morning departures to move at her own pace. I watched as she poured coffee, scrolling through her phone with the ease of someone who had no reason to feel guilty. I wanted to smash it out of her hand, to tell her I knew, to watch the color drain from her face as the truth crashed down on her. But instead I walked over, kissed the top of her head, and said, "See you tonight." She smiled up at me, completely unaware of the war she had started. At the hospital, Lucas was exactly as I expected. Calm, confident, performing his duties with the arrogance of a man who believed he was untouchable. I studied him between surgeries, watched the way he carried himself, the way he glanced at his phone with that same secretive tilt Melissa had adopted. He was playing a role just as carefully as she was. The perfect protege, the rising star, the man standing in my shadow waiting for his chance to replace me. What I hadn't realized until now was how long he had likely been planning it. It wasn't just the affair. That was the insult, not the injury. The real betrayal was what came next. The way he maneuvered himself into every high-profile case I handled. The way he subtly aligned himself with the department heads, the way he spoke to nurses and residents like he was already in a position of authority. He wasn't just sleeping with my wife. He was preparing to take my place, one careful step at a time. I had underestimated him. That would never happen again. By the time I left the hospital that evening, my mind had shifted from anger to strategy. I couldn't afford to act recklessly. If I confronted them now, Melissa would twist the narrative, paint herself as the victim of an emotionally distant husband. Lucas would play the role of the concerned friend who had simply been there for her. I had seen enough hospital politics to know how easily the truth could be manipulated. I needed proof. Not just of the affair, that was secondary. I needed something bigger, something that would dismantle everything they had built before they even realized the foundation was cracking. So I started small. That night at dinner, I let Melissa talk, watching her carefully for any signs of guilt, any hesitation. She had none. She sipped her wine, told me about her trip, filled in details with such effortless precision that I almost admired her ability to lie. When she asked about my week, I told her about a new case I was working on, fabricating an entire narrative to test her reaction. A malpractice suit, I said casually. Some of the younger doctors is under review, big mess, career ending if it goes the wrong way. She tilted her head, curious. Anyone I know? I shook my head. Not really, but it's interesting to watch. You'd be surprised how quickly a mistake can ruin everything. She smiled, took another sip of wine, and changed the subject. I memorized that moment. The ease, the dismissal, the way she had no idea that she had just given me the first real answer I needed. The next few weeks were an exercise in patience. I let Melissa continue her act, playing the devoted wife, while she carefully carved out spaces in her schedule for Lucas. I let Lucas believe he was safe, that his position in the hospital was secure, that no one was watching him maneuver himself into the future he thought he was entitled to. In truth, I watched everything. I noted the way he lingered too long near his phone between surgeries, the small smirk that played on his lips when he thought no one was looking, the way he subtly inserted himself into conversations with department heads. He was laying the groundwork for something bigger, something beyond just the affair. And if I had learned anything in my career, it was that a weak foundation only needed the right amount of pressure to collapse. I started by gaining access to Melissa's emails. She had always been careful with her passwords, but years of living together gave me enough insight into her habits. It took less than an hour to get in. What I found wasn't surprising, but it was thorough. Messages between her and Lucas stretched back over a year. Some were brief, confirmations of meetings, dinner plans, inside jokes. Others were more damning. There were hotel reservations, flight confirmations, legal documents discussing future financial plans. They weren't just having an affair. They were preparing for something permanent. She had even spoken to a divorce attorney. The date on the email was only 2 weeks old. That was when I knew that waiting was no longer an option. I spent the next few days laying the groundwork for my own plan. I made copies of every email, every reservation, every transaction. I compiled them into an organized folder, methodical, clinical, as if I were preparing for surgery. I wanted to see it all laid out, every detail of their betrayal, every calculated step they had taken behind my back. But that wasn't enough. I needed something that would break Lucas, something that would not only end his affair with Melissa, but ruin him entirely. That moment came on a Wednesday afternoon. Lucas had just finished an operation and was reviewing notes in his office when I knocked on his door. He looked up, startled for only a second before his face shifted into the confident, relaxed mask he always wore around me. "Dr. Carlisle," he greeted, standing up. "What can I do for you?" I closed the door behind me, taking my time as I moved toward his desk. "There's been a concern raised," I said evenly, placing a file down in front of him. "A patient from your last rotation. Complications after surgery. The board wants to review it." His expression barely flickered, but I saw the moment his composure wavered. He opened the file, scanning the notes, and I watched the muscles in his jaw tighten. He knew what this meant. An investigation into a complication wasn't uncommon, but if framed correctly, it could end a career. The right wording, the right pressure, and suddenly a mistake became negligence, and negligence had consequences. "This isn't," he started, but I cut him off. "I wanted to give you a heads up before the formal review," I said smoothly. "Give you a chance to prepare." He nodded, but I could see the calculation in his eyes. He was trying to assess how much I knew, whether this was an actual issue or something else. He didn't realize that the real trap was already in motion. That night, Melissa was late again. She walked through the door, phone in hand, texting quickly before she noticed me standing in the kitchen. She slipped the device into her bag, smiling at me like nothing had changed. "Long day?" I asked, pouring myself a drink. She sighed, setting her bag down. "Exhausting. I barely had time to eat." She was getting better at lying. Or maybe she had just stopped caring if I believed her. I sipped my drink, watching her as she moved through the room, unwinding from a day that hadn't been spent at work. I let her talk, let her go through the routine, let her believe that I was still the man she had been playing for years. But something in me had shifted. The waiting was over. It was time to let her see just how much of a mistake she had made. The morning of the hospital board review, Lucas walked into the building with his usual confidence, but I saw the tension in his posture. He knew something was wrong. The file I had placed on his desk had been just enough to unsettle him, just enough to plant the seed of doubt. He was too arrogant to believe his position was truly threatened, but the uncertainty was eating at him. I watched from across the hall as he spoke to one of the senior surgeons, his smile tight, his gestures more forced than usual. He was trying to gauge if anyone else had heard whispers about the review, trying to determine how serious this was. I had made sure there were whispers. A few carefully placed comments in the right ears, a few subtle suggestions that Lucas had been careless in surgery, that a patient had suffered because of his overconfidence. Nothing concrete, nothing that could be traced back to me, just enough to make people start questioning him. In a place like this, doubt was a disease. Once it spread, it was almost impossible to contain. At precisely 10 o'clock, the review panel assembled. Lucas sat at the long table, his expression carefully neutral. I took my seat across from him, my own face unreadable. Melissa had texted me that morning, a simple message. "Dinner tonight?" I hadn't responded. She had no idea what was coming. The chief of surgery opened the meeting, outlining the concern over a particular case Lucas had handled, a post-op complication that had led to a near-fatal infection. The record showed that the patient had been given the wrong post-separative antibiotics, leading to a severe reaction. Lucas listened, his face impassive, but I could see the calculation behind his eyes. He was already preparing his defense. When asked for his explanation, he leaned forward slightly, his voice calm. "With all due respect, this was an issue with the pharmacy's labeling. The medication was mislabeled, and the attending nurse administered it based on the information provided. I reviewed the records thoroughly, and there was no error on my part. A solid defense, predictable, but I had anticipated it." One of the senior board members adjusted his glasses, glancing at the paperwork in front of him. "Dr. Evans, are you aware that we conducted an internal audit of the pharmacy's records? The labeling issue you're referring to doesn't appear in our system. In fact, the prescribed medication was correctly documented in the patient's chart, but a separate override was made under your login credentials." For the first time, Lucas hesitated. Just for a second, just long enough for everyone in the room to register it. That's not possible," he said, his voice slightly tighter. "I would never alter a prescription like that." The room remained silent. No one accused him outright, but the weight of the implication was crushing. A doctor falsifying medical records to cover up a mistake was not just career-ending. It was a federal offense. I leaned back in my chair, watching as he processed the implications. He knew what was happening now. He knew that someone had set him up. But he couldn't prove it. And if he tried, all it would do was make him look desperate. The review ended without a final decision, but Lucas knew the damage had already been done. His reputation was no longer unshakable. The board would deliberate, but I had made sure their conclusion was inevitable. At best, he would walk away with a tarnished record. At worst, he would be stripped of his medical license. Either way, his days in this hospital were numbered. That evening, I drove home, knowing that the first phase was complete. Lucas would spend the next several days trying to salvage what was left of his career, trying to uncover how this had happened to him. And while he was focused on that, Melissa would be left completely exposed. She was waiting for me when I walked through the door, wine glass in hand, a small smile playing on her lips. "You ignored my text," she said, tilting her head slightly. "Busy day?" I set my keys on the counter, studying her. She was still playing the game, still pretending like nothing was wrong. I wondered if she had any idea that her perfect little plan was already unraveling. "You could say that," I replied. "Had an interesting meeting today." She took a slow sip of wine, her eyes watching me over the rim of her glass. "Something serious?" I shrugged. "Just a review, some complications on a case." Her expression didn't change, but I saw the faintest flicker of something behind her eyes. She knew. Not the full extent of it, not yet, but she knew something was happening. She was waiting for me to say his name, to confront her, to tip my hand. I didn't. Instead, I walked past her, heading upstairs without another word. I could feel her watching me, waiting for some kind of reaction. But there was nothing left to react to. The game was almost over. Now, it was just a matter of how hard the fall would be. Melissa's confidence started to crack the next morning. She thought I didn't notice the way she kept glancing at her phone during breakfast, how her fingers hovered over the screen as if waiting for a message that hadn't come. Lucas wasn't answering her. I didn't need to check to know that. He was too busy scrambling to salvage what was left of his career, trying to piece together how everything had collapsed so quickly. The beautiful irony was that he couldn't turn to her, not without revealing the full extent of their relationship. He had played the game so carefully, keeping their affair in the shadows, protecting his reputation, making sure no one could ever prove it. Now, that secrecy was working against him. He was alone, and Melissa was beginning to realize it. She set her phone down and looked up at me, forcing a smile. "You seem quiet today." I took a sip of coffee, meeting her gaze without expression. "Long night. A lot on my mind." She hesitated, then nodded as if that was the answer she had expected. "I thought maybe we could go out this weekend, just the two of us. It's been a while." I let her words settle between us, considering them. It wasn't an offer. It was damage control. She was trying to steady the ground beneath her feet, to keep me from looking too closely. She had no idea that I had already torn everything apart. I smiled, slow and deliberate. "That sounds nice." That evening, Lucas made his final mistake. He showed up at the hospital unannounced, marching through the halls like a man who still believed he had control over his own fate. I was in my office when he arrived, reviewing charts, pretending to be oblivious to the chaos I had created. I heard his footsteps before I saw him, the sharp, angry stride of someone who had run out of options. The door swung open without a knock. I didn't flinch. "We need to talk," he said, his voice tight, controlled. I glanced up at him, tilting my head slightly. "That's not how this works, Lucas. You don't barge into my office and demand anything." His jaw clenched. He closed the door behind him, lowering his voice. "I know what you did." I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands in my lap. "What exactly is it you think I did?" He let out a sharp breath, pacing in front of my desk. "The board review, the way it was framed, the records. I don't know how, but you set me up." I didn't answer immediately. I let the silence stretch between us, let him feel the weight of his own paranoia. He needed me to confirm it, to give him something solid to fight against. But I wasn't going to. Instead, I shrugged. "If you made a mistake, that's on you. You should have been more careful." His fists clenched at his sides. "You're not going to get away with this." I stood up slowly, stepping around my desk until there was barely a foot of space between us. "And what exactly are you going to do about it?" My voice was calm, even, but I saw the way his confidence wavered. He wanted to hit me. He wanted me to give him a reason, but he wasn't that kind of man. He was a coward, the kind who thrived when things were easy but fell apart the second the odds turned against him. He swallowed hard, stepping back. "This isn't over." I smiled. "Oh, Lucas, it was over before you even realized you were playing." He left without another word. 2 days later, the hospital board delivered their decision. Lucas was placed on indefinite suspension pending further investigation. It was a death sentence for his career. No reputable hospital would take him now, not with a potential malpractice case hanging over his head. He was finished. Melissa found out later that evening. I was in the study when I heard her phone ring. I didn't need to check to know who it was. There was silence at first. Then her voice, tight and strained. "What do you mean, suspension? That doesn't make sense." A pause. "No, I haven't heard anything about this. Just calm down, we'll figure it out." But even now, she still thought there was a future for them. I walked into the kitchen just as she hung up, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. She looked up at me, startled, as if she had forgotten I was there. "Something wrong?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. She hesitated, then shook her head. "No, just work stuff." I nodded, reaching for a glass. "You've seemed distracted lately." "I've just been stressed," she said quickly. "There's a lot going on at the firm." Another lie, another weak attempt to cover her tracks. I wondered if she even realized how obvious it had become. I poured myself a drink, then turned to face her fully. "You should be careful, Melissa. Stress makes people careless, makes them miss things." Her expression faltered just for a second, just long enough for me to see the fear start to creep in. She had no idea how much more she was about to lose. Melissa unraveled faster than I expected. The moment Lucas fell, she realized just how exposed she was. The security she had built for herself, the careful balancing act between her career, her marriage, and her affair, had crumbled in a matter of days. She was left standing in the wreckage, waiting for me to make my move. She didn't have to wait long. I came home late that Friday, the house eerily quiet. Normally, Melissa would be watching television, scrolling through her phone, or pretending to read one of the expensive hardcover books she liked to keep on display. Tonight, though, she was just sitting there, motionless, staring at the dark screen of the television with an untouched glass of wine in her hand. She looked exhausted, but not in the way she used to after long days in court. This was different. This was the exhaustion of someone who knew they were losing a game they never thought they could lose. Her phone was on the coffee table in front of her, screen up, unlocked. A message was still open. Lucas's name at the top. A single desperate text lingering at the bottom. "Call me. We need to fix this." She hadn't responded. Maybe she didn't know how. Maybe, for the first time in her life, she had run out of ways to manipulate a situation to her advantage. I stepped inside, letting the sound of the door closing fill the silence between us. She looked up slowly, her fingers tightening around the stem of her glass. I could see the tension in her posture, the way she was holding herself together by sheer force of will. "You're home late," she said, her voice carefully neutral. I set my keys down on the counter, loosened my tie, and studied her. "Long day?" She nodded, taking a slow sip of her wine, though I could tell she wasn't actually tasting it. Her eyes flicked toward her phone, then back to me. She was waiting for me to say something, to give her a clue as to how much I knew. "Did you talk to Lucas?" I asked casually, as if I didn't already know the answer. The question made her grip tighten on the glass. She hesitated for a fraction of a second too long before answering. "Why would I?" A lie. I didn't respond right away. I let the silence stretch between us, watching her shift under the weight of it. She was trying to stay calm, to keep playing her part, but the cracks in her facade were starting to show. "I heard he was suspended," she added, feigning mild curiosity. "That's unfortunate." I exhaled slowly, nodding. "Yeah, unfortunate." She wet her lips, setting her glass down carefully on the table. "You don't seem surprised." I tilted my head slightly, considering her. "Should I be?" Her breath hitched just a little, a barely perceptible reaction, but I caught it. She knew. Maybe not everything, but enough to understand that I had something to do with Lucas's downfall, enough to realize that the ground beneath her feet wasn't as solid as she thought. She reached for her phone, hesitated, then pulled her hand back. "What exactly are you trying to say, Andrew?" I studied her for a moment longer before stepping forward and pulling a neatly prepared folder from my bag. I set it on the table between us. She glanced at it, then back at me, her expression wary. "What's this?" "Open it." She hesitated, but curiosity won out. She flipped open the folder, her eyes scanning the first page. Divorce papers. Comprehensive, airtight, every financial loophole she had been counting on already closed. She frowned, flipping to the next page, and then the next. Her breath grew uneven as she realized what she was looking at. "This," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't fair." I arched an eyebrow. "Fair?" She swallowed hard, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edges of the folder. "You're trying to cut me out of everything?" I said nothing. She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Jesus, Andrew, you really planned all of this, didn't you?" I leaned back against the counter, crossing my arms. "You thought you had it all figured out, Melissa. The affair, the divorce, the money. You had a plan, didn't you? Thought you could walk away with everything while I was too busy to notice. But you made one mistake." She blinked, her throat working as she tried to force down whatever emotions were threatening to surface. "What mistake?" "You underestimated me." Her jaw clenched, her fingers tightening around the papers as if she could will them into changing, but they wouldn't. Every safeguard she had put in place, every contingency she had planned for, was worthless now. Tears welled in her eyes, but I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no anger, just a quiet certainty that this was the end. "You can take some time to think about it," I said, standing. "But my offer is simple. You sign, and you walk away with what's left of your dignity. Drag this out, and I will make sure you lose more than just this marriage." Her breath hitched again, her shoulders rising and falling with the effort to hold herself together. "You really hate me that much?" I looked at her for a long moment, then shook my head. "No, I just don't care anymore." I turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the ruins of what she had built.